All right, part 4 of lecture 4. We're going to wrap up this one with a discussion of Pablo Neruda, who, like Rainer Maria Rilke, is just a wonderful poet, one of the best poets of the 20th century. And so I'm so grateful to have the opportunity. I feel very blessed to have the opportunity to be able to discuss poetry with you, to lecture on it a little bit, and to read your thoughts about it. Through reading your discussion board posts, I feel like it's not the same as a conversation in the classroom, but I feel like I'm connecting with you with your thoughts about the literature, and I love that. And I'm glad we get to bring some poetry into the mix. Poetry is challenging at first, but once you learn how to read it, it's so rewarding. So I hope that you gain a passion for poetry through this class, through Baudelaire and Rilke and Neruda. Neruda was the son of a railroad worker and a school teacher of Spanish and Indian ancestry. So he was born in Chile, and he had a very, interesting background, but he became arguably the most important Latin American poet of the 20th century. His influence and the significance of it is pretty far-reaching. His mother died a month after birth, and they moved from a very small village, really, to a more frontier town where his father quickly remarried. The name of that town was Temuco, I believe, and that's where he had his schooling growing up. But because it was this type of frontier town, it was, the focus was industry, and so his father did not approve of Neruda's literary pursuits and didn't really nurture him in that way. So instead of seeking guidance from his parents, and the nurturing of his literary pursuits, like some of our authors, like Borges did, for instance. Instead, he found a mentor in a woman named Gabriela Mistral, who was actually the principal of the girls' school in the town where he lived, and she was an accomplished writer herself who won the Nobel Prize in 1945. So she became his mentor, and under her guidance, he started publishing poetry as early as age 13. That's right. Age 13. Pretty impressive. Especially when you take a look at his poetry. Now, the poetry, we're going to look at is obviously, I'm sure, much more accomplished than what he did at that age, but pretty impressive nonetheless. So we should talk about his name. His birth name, which I'm not going to quote for you now because I don't have it written down in front of me, he thought reflected the provinces where he was from, and he wanted a name not associated with the provinces. And so everyone really knows him by his pen name or his pseudonym now rather than his birth name. He took the given name, or the first part of the name, Pablo, and just a very common given name in Chile, and named himself that, but the name Pablo means Paul. And so most scholars, they're not 100% sure, but most of them think this is an allusion to St. Paul, from the New Testament, who really carried out the ministry of Jesus from the middle of the book of Acts on forward after Jesus' ascension. So St. Paul is the reference there. And the reference with the surname or the last name is a Czech writer named Jan Neruda, who was just a very accomplished writer, one of Pablo Neruda's literary heroes. And so, I think he thought the combination of those two names, Pablo and Neruda, sounded very Chilean, but not of the provinces, and was an allusion to, a biblical hero, a saint, and then also a literary hero. So he liked that combination of factors in the sound of the name. He was appointed the nation's council to a number of countries. So Neruda, much like Rilke and Borges and Tagore and other writers we've studied, was a cosmopolitan in the sense of he traveled around the world, visited different places, and learned from them, including Burma, which is today called Myanmar, and Ceylon, which is today called Sri Lanka, which was a colony, I think still at that time, a colony of the British Empire, and a number of other places. The final places on his journeys, and this was in the 1930s, I think the late 1920s through 1936, was the final two locations were Madrid and Barcelona, so in Spain. And in 1936, when he was in Spain, that's when the Spanish Civil War broke out. Um, the Spanish Civil War was a really intense, bloody conflict that I'm surprised I haven't mentioned it yet. There are just so many wars and conflicts and atrocities in the 20th century that it's easy to forget one, sadly enough. And so the Spanish Civil War was quite significant. I mean, it was a battle against fascists. There's some really good literary works that are representative of it. Ernest Hemingway's novel For Whom the Bell Tolls um, is the story of an American reporter who goes to report on the Spanish Civil War and everyone he meets there. I'd argue it's Hemingway's best novel. It's very good. And then the film, you probably might be more familiar with this, Pan's Labyrinth. I'm dating myself with that one. It's about 14 years old, I think, but it's a really impressive film, so you may still have heard of it. Pan's Labyrinth by Guillermo del Toro depicts the horrors of the Spanish Civil War, where a young girl uses kind of a fantasy life to escape away from those horrors. And so, again, like all of the modern authors we've studied in this lecture, Neruda saw the horrors of the war up front and close, but he really saw them. He had a number of friends who were also poets with whom he lived and worked with there, and one of them was actually killed in the war pretty brutally. And that moment forever changed him, forever changed his style of poetry. And in that sense, Neruda is very much a modern author. He's really like a quintessential modern man because we can see how sharply in his poetry he was affected by the horrors of modernity. And so that's the last point here. It caused him to move. There's this transition you can see, and I use alliteration or the rhyming of the first syllable to illustrate this transition. His poetry goes from personal to public to political. So his early poetry that we see in things like I Could Write and Walking Around is very personal. And then with explaining a few things, we have the public focus. And then late in his life, he became very involved in politics. So there's some pieces of biography I've left off here that are still important, but I just didn't have room, so you can look them up in the textbook. But basically, after he toured these different places and saw the Spanish Civil War, because of different regimes in power in Chile, he couldn't return home until 1952. And then, again, different regimes were in power at different times. He actually ran for political office and ceded the election, though he didn't win. He handed it over to another candidate who he thought really represented his beliefs. He was a communist and part of the Communist Party, so he ceded to another communist candidate who actually won the election. But then another regime came to power after that, and the protests against that new regime, the first protest of it took place at his funeral, which was a very fitting death for someone who's had such a public political focus late in his life. So you can see those transitions from personal to public to all the way to political, which again I think really mark him as a quintessential version of the modern man. And he died in 1973, as I just mentioned, but won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 71. So I really only have two threads here, which I know is kind of a break from the norm, but what his poems are fairly long. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, compared to other poets, they're not that long, but compared to someone like Rilke, he's a different kind of a lyric poet. They're more drawn out, a little more narrative, not quite that narrative, but more kind of drawn out, whereas Rilke's are compact. And so I want to just go through the poems and let the ideas kind of come out organically as we go through them and have plenty of time for that. So I only have two threads here, two guiding things. The first is a statement from the textbook that I think encapsulates Neruda so well and really shows why he's so enduringly popular. I mean, he's Ted Mosby from How I Met Your Mother. He's one of his favorite poets. So if Neruda is resonating that much in the mainstream public sphere, he's very influential. Why is that? It's because he evokes the most elemental levels of human emotion and human experience. So he gets right down to the nitty-gritty core of what affects us, what drives our hearts as humans. Few poets, I would say, understand the human soul as well as Neruda. But he does it with a beautiful language. It's the nitty-gritty, but it's beautiful. Um, but it's not grotesque either. It's just real, vibrant. Um, and then I've already said his focus in his poems moves from the personal to the public to the political throughout his career. So I'm going to look at two poems. Tonight I Can Write, which I would say is his most personal poem. And then I'm explaining a few things, which is a public kind of political poem. It's really the poem. It describes the death of his friend that I mentioned earlier. And so it's really the poem that marks the transition for him from personal writing to public writing and really defines him as the quintessentially modern man. So we're going to look at both of those in detail to illustrate that transition. And then I'm not going to discuss Walking Around or Ode to the Tomato. Those are both great, wonderful poems, and you're welcome to write about any of these four poems. I haven't included the general canto because it's much longer. It's like a 10-page excerpt from a long narrative poem. You're more than welcome to read it, but you're not required to. I would love to read that long narrative poem, the whole thing, not just the excerpt, sometime when I have more time, because Neruda is a great poet. I don't have that time right now. So if you want to take it on, I'd love to read your thoughts on it, but it's not required. All right, so let's take a look at Tonight I Can Write and see what Neruda is able to do when he's writing about personal experience on the personal level, but cutting to the depth of that human emotion and experience. Tonight I can write the saddest lines. Write, for example, the night is shattered and the blue stars shiver in the distance. The night wind revolves in the sky and sings. Tonight I can write the saddest lines. I loved her, and sometimes she loved me too. So what we have here is this intermingling of the speaker of the poem and nature. He's not necessarily thinking about this past love, this lost love from the past, until he immerses himself in the night. And so the title of the poem is interesting. It speaks to ability or capacity. Tonight, I can write. So why can he write tonight? Because of the night. It's very interesting how the night moves. It's almost personified here. It shatters, it shivers, it revolves. And so he's kind of caught up in this swirling night, and that brings out the emotions, the lamenting over this past life. Very personal, but that connection between human and the nature gives him the ability, tonight I can write. Through nights like this one, I held her in my arms. I kissed her again and again under the endless sky. She loved me sometimes, and I loved her too. How could one not have loved her great still eyes? Tonight I can write the saddest lines. To think that I do not have her, to feel that I have lost her. To hear the immense night still more immense without her, and the verse falls to the soul like dew to the pasture. So the night reminds him of her because they spent nights like this together, kind of a stormy, swirling night. And you have the refrain, tonight I can write the saddest lines again. And it's interesting, the title is Tonight I Can Write ... But every time he says tonight I can write in the poem, he says tonight I can write the saddest lines. So the title really speaks to potential. And I think since he only gives us one version of that potentiality, the title combined with when he actually says it in the refrain in the poem asks us to look at what else is possible. What else can he write besides the saddest lines? I think that's a question we're supposed to have throughout. The line that really sticks out to me here from these next four stanzas in particular is, how could one not have loved her great still eyes? So it's almost like his love for her was beyond his control. And I think we've all felt that before, where we're overcome with a kind of passion. Again, the knight represents that. And so he's, again, getting to the deepest human emotions. And then those last lines, to hear the immense night, still more immense without her. And the verse falls to the soul like dew to the pasture. That's a beautiful rhyming translation. But again, the experiences are intermingled, the human and the nature. So the night reminds him of her because it's intense. Their love was intense and they spent nights like this together. But remembering her makes the night even more intense. So that aspect of the poem continues. What does it matter that my love could not keep her? The night is shattered and she is not with me. This is all. In the distance someone is singing. In the distance. My soul is not satisfied that it has lost her. My sight tries to find her as though to bring her closer. My heart looks for her and she is not with me. The same night whitening the same trees, we of that time are no longer the same. I no longer love her, that's certain, but how I loved her. My voice tried to find the wind to touch her hearing. So what's really interesting is you have kind of a twist here. He says he's lamenting this lost love the whole poem, but he says he no longer loves her. So it's an intense feeling, but one he no longer has, but the past brings it back. And so I don't know if he still loves her. I don't think he does, but it's so intense, it's kind of overpowering him in the moment. And again, she's connected to the night, right? Remember that theme. The night reminds him of her because it's intense, like her love was intense. They spent nights like this together. The memories making the night more intense. So now he almost tries to reach her. He says, my voice tried to find the wind to touch her hearing. I'm not sure if he's talking about the love here or the person who is singing, but either way, he feels like he can have that human connection because the human and the night are so connected. Finally, the last four stanzas. Another, she will be another's, as she was before my kisses, her voice, her bright body, her infinite eyes. So here he's able to acknowledge that her love is part of a larger existence. Other people loved her before him and will love her after him. I no longer love her, that's certain, but maybe I love her. Love is so short, forgetting is so long. So he's conflicted, I think he's for the most part, this is a long time ago, he's moved past this, but he hasn't fully been able to let it go. And that's why the memories are coming back. So this poem is in a large part about finally being able to let go of that. And the line here, love is so short, forgetting is so long. I don't know if there's ever been a line in poetry that describes the experience of lost or tragic love better than that line. Love is so short, forgetting is so long. I'm not even going to sully it with an attempt at an explanation. You know what it means and you know how great of a line it is. Because through nights like this one I held her in my arms, my soul is not satisfied that it has lost her. So this line is important because other than the title, I think it's the only one he repeats multiple times. And so this, I think, really connects with the first line of the previous stanza. I no longer love her, that's certain, but maybe I love her. It's a past love. He'd moved past it, but he never fully let it go. So he's doesn't necessarily want to be with her now. He doesn't still love her, but he has not completely let her go. He's not satisfied that he did lose her years ago when he lost her. Though this be the last pain that she makes me suffer, and these the last verses that I write for her. So a finality is coming up. But the thing I want to point out is interiority. Remember the focus of the modernists on the interior mind? We have the evolution of the speaker's thoughts here. This is really a great example of interiority, that you see the progression of how his thoughts evolve, but they're kind of chaotic. He loves her or he doesn't. The night is bringing up all these past emotions and we get a deep glimpse inside his mind. I'm going to reread the penultimate stanza as I read the last one here. Oh, excuse me, that was the last stanza. Okay, that makes more sense. So I just have a bullet point there. And now, yeah, this makes sense. So I'll read the last stanza again. Though this be the last pain that she makes me suffer, and these the last voices that I write for her. So my conclusion here, my thesis about this poem, is that the night brings back to mind this past love that is over. He's not trying to resurrect that love, but he hasn't fully been able to let it go. So tonight I can write the saddest lines. Tonight I can write ... What else can he write? Writing. I've long believed this and experienced it myself. Writing provides catharsis. That's the Greek word for purgation, and it meant the feeling you had at the end of a play where you have these emotions wrapped up in the characters, and then the play ends, the tragedy plays out, and those emotions are purged from you. So writing is one of the most cathartic ways to purge the emotions associated with a past love and mend a wounded heart. And so that's what the speaker of the poem is able to write here. He's finally able to write about this love, and we see the interiority, the progression of his thoughts, where he goes from lamenting it to realizing he doesn't really still love her, to seeing the love was so strong, even though he doesn't still love her, he's struggling to let it go. But then by talking about it, he's finally able to let it go. So the act of writing, tonight I can write, mends what was broken and helps him finally let go of this past love. So an incredibly personal poem. It's probably his most famous poem. Well, the tomato is pretty famous, but this one's right up there. So it's a poem like that that makes him the favorite poet of romantics like Ted Mosby. But there was a shift. That was 1924. Let's jump ahead 12 years to 1936. Think about everything we just learned. The interiority, the evolution of the speaker's thoughts, the ability to purge suffering emotions. That doesn't make sense. The ability to purge painful emotions through writing. Those same ideas appear in this poem. I'm explaining a few things, but this is an incredibly public and personal poem at the same time that shows his break from being able to write about the beautiful night and the lost love to now I must focus on the harsh realities of a modern world of war and death. I can't get past these things. I must be a political advocate. Here we literally see the story that shows that transition for Neruda. You're going to ask, and where are the lilacs, and the poppy-petaled metaphysics, and the rain repeatedly spattering, its words and drilling them full of apertures and birds. So Neruda is self-reflective here. He knows this poem is a transition point for him. And so he knows his readers will potentially be disappointed that he's no longer writing poems like If I Could Only Write and Walking Around. So he's addressing those expectations, saying, you're expecting me to write about these things. Things as beautiful as poppy-petaled metaphysics. What a great line. But instead, you're going to get something else. So he's preparing his audience, but at the same time, using their expectations as kind of a segue to get to the point he wants to make in this poem. I'll tell you all the news. So he's saying, you're expecting this. Here's what you're going to. I lived in a suburb of Madrid with bells and clocks and trees. So there's a more narrative element here. In the last poem, we had kind of the narrative of the progression of his thoughts. Here we have a narrative of what happens to him in Spain. So he sets the stage. He's living in Madrid for this story. There you could look out over Castile's dry face. A leather ocean. My house was called the House of Flowers because in every cranny geraniums burst. It was a good-looking house with its dogs and children. So Castile is another word for Spain, so he personifies Spain here. You know, it's dry. It has a dry face stretched out over the leather ocean. And so Spain is almost like a character here because Spain is just such a vibrant, interesting country and was so plagued by war. At this time, it's really like a character in the story. And then he describes his house, over bursting over with flowers and dogs and children. So it's a very domestic life. He's setting the stage here. The tragedy is coming. It's like when you're watching a movie and everything seems so nice, something bad is about to happen. Remember Raw? Raphael? Federico, do you remember? From under the ground where the light of June drowned flowers in your mouth? Brother, my brother. So he asked his friend. Raphael was another poet. And this poem is about the death of another poet friend of theirs, Federico, who was killed in the Spanish Civil War. So he's saying, hey, do you remember our friend? And then that beautiful but painful line, the light of June drowned flowers in your mouth, shows that he's passed away. So he set this all up. He said, you're expecting poems like I've written before, but here's what you're getting. He sets the stage, sets the scene. Now he uses this dialogue to transition. From here, we're going to jump into what actually happens, the meat of the everything, loud with big voices, the salt of merchandises, pile-ups of palpitating bread, the stalls of my suburb of Iguales, with its statue like a drained inkwell and a swirl of hake. Oil flowed into spoons, a deep bang of feet and hands swelled in the streets. Meters, liters, the sharp measure of life, stacked up fish, the texture of roofs with a cold sun in which the weather vane falters. The fine, frenzied ivory of potatoes, wave on wave of tomatoes rolling down to the ocean, to the sea, sorry. So you have a backdrop here, a backdrop for the bloodshed that's about to come. And so this is very much like how the knight functioned in the previous poem. He's setting the stage. So here you have like the busyness of modernity and kind of a marketplace scene. And again, it's the backdrop. We've progressed from the domestic tranquil house to a busy marketplace. We're starting to see the onset of modernity. Now we're going to see this is maybe not ideal, but now we're going to transition from here to kind of the worst of modernity. In one morning all that was burning, one morning the bonfires leapt out of the earth, devouring human beings, and from then on fire, gunpowder from then on, and from then on blood. Bandits with plains and moors, bandits with finger rings and duchesses, bandits with black friars spattering blessings came through the sky to kill children, and the blood of children ran through the streets without fuss, like children's blood. So it's a horrific scene. You really get the horrors of war, of modernity here. The bandits are the fascists, the rebels were fighting against in the Spanish Revolution. And he uses the term bandit, because the term bandito is kind of a famous term from the Spanish language. So it's a villain. He's clearly painting the fascists as the villains here. So he's drawing on local iconography to establish that role, that the fascists are the villains within the horrors of modernity. Jackals that the jackals would despise, stones that the dry thistle would bite on and spit out, vipers that the vipers would abominate. So he's building on the bandito thing here and showing that it's even worse. It's like these are the worst possible people because they would kill children, they would kill his friend. So, jackals and vipers are snakes. There's kind of like always certain stereotypes associated with certain animals. They're like the worst ones in the animal kingdom, like using biblical imagery, the viper, the snake is the worst. So these fascists that have killed his friend and would kill children are vipers that the vipers would abominate. So the worst snakes would hate these snakes. They're worse than snakes is the conclusion you draw from that. Face to face with you I have seen the blood of Spain tower like a tide to drown you in one wave of pride and knife. So with this stanza, I see like all of the bloodshed, all of the horrors of modernity he's just described have coalesced. They've come together into a huge tidal wave, and that wave is going to consume Spain. One of the most famous poems of modernism is The Second Coming by William Butler Yeats, with some of the most beautiful language I've ever read describes the horrors of World War One, and he does it so beautiful and so well that it's so horrific. And it's a wonderful poem. It's one of my favorite poems. We read it in this class, but you really get it in the British literature surveys because he's Irish. As an Irishman, he'd be a great choice for world literature. We probably should have read something for Ireland, but Ireland's always included in the Brit Lit surveys, and I'm really trying to avoid the Brit Lit. But that poem by Yeats has one of its lines is the ceremony of innocence is drowned. And I see that here, this tidal wave of bloody modernity consuming Spain. And you and I, his friend and him, are watching it together. We're watching it too as the reader. Treacherous generals see my dead house, look at broken Spain. From every house burning metal flows. Instead of flowers from every socket of Spain, Spain emerges, and from every dead child a rifle with eyes. And from every crime bullets are born, which will one day find the bull's eye of your hearts. So the line, from every house burning metal flows. I don't think any phrase describes modernity better than the phrase burning metal. And from every house it flows. So again, Spain is being consumed by this tidal wave of bloody modernity. And at the end of this stanza, you have probably the most poetic part of the poem because it's filled with personification. Bullets come alive. Bullets are born out of the dead children who've been killed in the war. I don't know if you have like a grimmer message than that in a poem. And what does it mean? Well, war births more war. I mean, it you can't stop war with war is what he's saying here. It's just going to get worse. And so a new bullet is born from the crimes, the bullets that have already killed people. And this new bullet that's born is coming straight for your heart. Your heart is bullseye. So war begets more war, and war will destroy us all eventually. And you will ask, why doesn't his poetry speak of dreams and leaves and the great volcanoes of his native land? So he's wrapping up here. He's coming back to the original question. Why isn't he writing about the things he usually writing about? And here is the answer. Here is the thesis for this poem. Here is the thing that makes Neruda the quintessentially modern man. It's the same line repeated 3 times. Why can't I write about the night and beauty and love? Because come and see the blood in the streets. Come and see the blood in the streets. Come and see the blood in the streets. He's seen the blood in the streets. He's forever a changed man. He repeats the same things 3 times to answer the question. He can't it's such a finite thing. With what he has seen, he cannot go back. And that phrase probably sums up modernity. It's the ceremony of innocence drowned, like I just said from the Yeats poem. It's the ultimate loss of innocence. He can't recover what he had before seeing the horrors of war in the Spanish Civil War. And I think that's what modernity really drove home as people were seeing war as it truly is for the first time. So, I mean, it's not a cheery note to end on, and the next note I have isn't necessarily that hopeful either. With a wounded heart, you can write and you can purge those emotions. You can suffer for the last time. That's what he says. Here, I think the writing is still cathartic. It still helps. But you don't suffer for the last time, like when you're putting to rest an old lost love. So there's an intentional contrast here in these 2 poems. He's not able to move past this, even though writing about it certainly helps. Like he's able to move past the lost love. So, I think we have to come back to Dostoevsky and come back to Rilke for hope. I think Neruda is a beautiful poet, but I think I like Rilke more because I think Neruda probably saw even worse things than Rilke saw. But with what Rilke saw, he was still able to focus on the spiritual. And the Swan, I think we have a kind of optimism we don't see in Neruda, who the earlier Neruda, the Neruda that's the romantic, can't escape the blood of the Spanish Civil War. So I think for hope, we have to turn to Rilke. And that's why, even though they're both very good, he's the superior poet. Because Rilke says this painful existence, the blood in the streets, the blood in the streets, the blood in the streets, that's not our natural existence. There's something beyond this existence that's what we're truly meant for. And I think we need that kind of spiritual hope. They're both amazing poets. They're both two of the best poets of the 20th century, but um, Rilke was the one who brought a spiritual scope to his poetry. But if you want to truly understand the modern world and truly understand the 20th century, I think Neruda takes us right there, and he does it in a beautiful, amazing way. And especially his romantic poems are some of the best romantic poems ever written. And his poems like this one are some of the most vibrant, real poems ever written. And we need that. We need to confront that reality. I mean, after all, that's the philosophy. That's what this class is about, right?